When we get playable Archons, it's no secret that Hoyoverse wants to make them strong in at least one aspect of combat, and rightfully so. Venti has insane grouping, Zhongli has the strongest shield in the game, Raiden generates energy for your team, Nahida has superior Dendro application, and Furina has ridiculous damage percent buffs. That begs the question, what does Mavuika have to offer? Well, the answer to that is just damage, pure damage. Mavuika's tap skill is not so representative of that since it's more of a supportive ability. Tapping your skill simply allows Mavuika to summon a ring behind your active character that strikes every 2 seconds to deal pyro damage to all nearby enemies in about the same range that a Bennett burst covers. While that isn't strictly better than a character like Xiangling when it comes to pyro application rate, it's still a nice substitute / side grade when you don't want to run Xiangling. The hold skill is where we start to see Mavuika's potential as an on-field carry. Holding Mavuika's skill allows her to mount her motorbike and convert all of her normal charge and plunge attacks into pyro damage. The charge attacks where she does donuts on her bike have much better damage output compared to her normal attacks, so like Chasca, who rarely uses her normal attacks, Mavuika follows that same philosophy as well. To further bolster her charge attacks, we turn to Mavuika's burst, where she is the first character in Genshin to get an elemental burst that does not use energy as a resource. Instead, in order to cast your burst, you need at least 100 points of what the game calls Fighting Spirit, and you can accumulate up to 200 points to linearly increase the bonuses from her burst when casting it per extra Fighting Spirit consumed. As for what those bonuses are, casting your burst and consuming Fighting Spirit allows Mavuika to gain super armor, spend 7 seconds on her bike without consuming Night Soul points, and buff the damage multiplier of both the initial hit of her burst and the multipliers of her pyro attacks. With that being said, Fighting Spirit can only be accumulated in 2 ways. The first is by your active character normal attacking, but this will only give 1.5 Fighting Spirit per attack and will only result in 20 to 30 Fighting Spirit over a rotation, depending on the attack speed of your active character. The second way is through consuming Night Soul points, and that converts to Fighting Spirit via a 1-to-1 ratio. Like most other Natlan characters, Mavuika generates 80 Night Soul points with her skill. So that means even with just one more Natlan character to pair with Mavuika, you can easily get around 160 Fighting Spirit, not including any normal attacks you do, and that gets you fairly close to maxing out the bonuses from her elemental burst. Because her initial burst hit already has a really high multiplier and she's a pyro character that can vaporize or melt a good portion of the hard hitting attacks from her kit, adding the bonuses from her burst turns her into a ridiculous damage dealer. And if that wasn't enough, her Ascension passes pretty much give her a free 30% attack buff and up to 40% decaying damage bonus depending on how much Fighting Spirit she consumes when casting her burst. With all this damage loaded into her kit, it's hard to find fault in her combat strength. Really, the only inconveniences you'll encounter with Mavuika are that her teammate options are limited right now due to the way her burst heavily incentivizes running a second Natlan character, and that energy recharge is a dead stat on her, as we'll cover in the artifact section. If there's one thing that doesn't ever change, it's the 4-set Obsidian Codex being absolutely broken on Natlan DPS characters. I'm surprised they didn't add a new pair of artifact sets in patch 5.3, and even if they did, it would be pretty hard to make the 4-set Obsidian Codex not Mavuika's best set. Even without the true 100% uptime, the damage increase from this set is so high that even if you're not on fielding Mavuika, just the insane damage multiplier on her initial burst hit makes it hard to justify running any type of support set that decreases her personal damage. An example support set would be the 4-set scroll of the Hero of Cinder City, which should only be run on specific teams. For example, if you want to support Mualani with Mavuika's off-field pyro application, the 4-set scroll on Mavuika is fine, especially for those missing key Natlan supports like Shilonen on their account. But aside from that, sets like the 4-set Noblesse Oblige for a small burst buff and team attack percent buff, or the 4-set Marchese Hunter with Furina for the crit rate are all older options that you can at least temporarily run on Mavuika until you farm the new Natlan domains. As for artifact stats, you want to run Elemental Mastery or attack percent in the Sands, pyro damage percent in the Goblet, and crit damage or crit rate in the Circlet depending on what you're missing. Contrary to standard builds, Elemental Mastery is actually better than attack percent on Mavuika a lot of the times due to a variety of factors. Some of those factors include the abundance of attack percent buffs from her Ascension passive, weapon passives, Bennett, and the Pyro Resonance, as well as the fact that she can trigger Vaporize and Melt on a decent amount of the hard-hitting attacks from her kit. Attack percent is a safe option that provides flexibility outside of Vaporize and Melt teams such as Chevreuse teams or teams where she supports another Natlan DPS like Mualani or Kinich. Substat focus is crit stats, elemental mastery, attack percent, and flat attack in that order of priority. Remember that although Mavuika's initial skill cast does generate energy for the team, she herself does not benefit from any energy, and thus energy recharge is a dead substat on her pieces. As much as we meme on flat defense, even rolling flat defense is slightly better than ER because at least it gives your Mavuika some extra survivability. Moving into Mavuika's weapons, everything looks pretty standard. Like many other recent characters, her signature weapon is about 25% better than your free-to-play options, and in between you have your high-end 4-star weapons and 5-star crit stat sticks. Whether that's a good or bad thing, I'll leave that up to you to decide. Regardless, 1000 Blazing Suns is the name of her signature claymore, and it has an extremely high base attack with a really low crit rate stat. Where this weapon really shines is the passive, which almost unconditionally gives Mavuika up to 35% crit damage and 49% attack. That sort of raw power is hard to match for other claymores, but you do have a lot of options that are only 10 to 15% less DPS than her signature. Some of those options include an R5 Serpent Spine, Beacon of the Reed Sea, Redhorn Stonethresher, Verdict, and Fang of the Mountain King. Let's start with the R5 Serpent Spine and Beacon of the Reed Sea first. Believe it or not, an R5 Serpent Spine at max stacks deals slightly more damage than any other claymore aside from Mavuika's signature. The only caveat is that you may not have R5, or you can't guarantee perfect gameplay to always have 5 stacks on its passive without a shield. That's where Beacon of the Reed Sea comes in as the most consistent 5-star option that even rewards you with an extra 20% attack on its passive if you do end up getting hit. The only issue with this weapon is the high crit rate stat when paired with the Forza Obsidian Codex's 40% crit rate, so with this weapon you always want to run a crit damage circlet. For the other 3 5-star claymores that I mentioned, these are all nice options for high base attack with at least usable passives for Mavuika, but there's nothing much to say about them aside from the fact that they all perform around the same level. So instead of yapping about limited 5-star weapons that most people won't really have, I want to spend some time on the free-to-play 4-star options instead. The best free-to-play weapon on Mavuika is Mailed Flower, which many players may have not heard of. This is an event claymore from patch 3.5, and its passive gives the wielder 24% attack and 96 elemental mastery for 8 seconds after triggering an elemental reaction. In teams where you can ensure Mavuika has this passive up before casting her burst, you can get insane melt or vaporize damage on that giant initial burst hit. However, for those who weren't playing during patch 3.5, there are 3 alternatives for Mailed Flower. The first is the Fontaine craftable Tidal Shadow. In teams that don't utilize Melt or Vaporize like a Chevreuse Overload team, this weapon can be just as good or even slightly better than Mailed Flower thanks to its flexible attack percent passive when the wielder gets healed. The second and third options are Rain Slasher and Blackcliff Slasher. Rain Slasher is kind of a budget version of Mailed Flower specifically for Vaporize teams only, and Blackcliff is purely just a crit damage stat stick with a very situational passive. Both of these options are clearly worse than Tidal Shadow and Mailed Flower, but if you don't want to use or don't have any claymore billets to craft an R5 Tidal Shadow, they can serve as last resort options. As I mentioned before, the biggest inconvenience with Mavuika upon her release is her teammate options. Because our Natlan cast isn't fully filled out yet, Citlali and Shilonen are the only 2 premium Natlan supports for Mavuika until more are released in the future. If you do not have these characters, Mavuika is still an extremely strong character, but there will be a damage discrepancy larger than most other characters see when missing their key supports. You'll see as we cover a few example teams that depending on the team, the lack of these characters does not mean Mavuika is unplayable, but instead will settle with workable substitutes or just force feed Mavuika with buffs from older meta units like Farina, Kazuha, or Sucrose. The first team to cover is a Melt team, which is usually not a reaction that we build around every day. The reason why I like this team is because although the team shines the best with the trio of Bennett, Mavuika, and Citlali, we do have plenty of other options as well. Citlali is the best support for Mavuika in Melt for a variety of reasons, but it really just boils down to the fact that she stacks Mavuika's fighting spirit and has enough cryo application for Mavuika to consistently get Melt reactions on her burst and 2 charge attacks. The shield she provides is nice for Mavuika, but during her burst she does get super armor like Raiden does, and you'll only feel like the shield is necessary whenever she's outside the 7-second window of her burst and actually can get knocked back. Other things Citlali offers are the ability to wield the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayer's catalyst and providing a shield that shreds pyro res whenever a melt reaction is triggered. Substitutes for Citlali as the cryo applicator include Rosaria, Kaya, or Charlotte, but it should be pretty clear that all of the other benefits that I just listed go out the window. The final slot is usually Shilonen for those that have her, but other options that you can consider are Kazuha, Sucrose, Kachina, or a second character out of any of the previously mentioned cryo options, plus Diona/Layla for shielding in the absence of Citlali. For melt, your rotation and team setup is extremely important in determining how many melts Mavuika can get. For example, with Citlali, you can start with Mavuika E, set up Shilonen buffs, set up Bennett buffs, set up Citlali's cryo, and then burst with Mavuika. Once you melt your 4th charge attack, doing a jump cancel and waiting for cryo to be applied again before your 5th charge attack allows you to get 2 more melts before your rotation ends. With other cryo applicators like Rosaria, this sort of jump cancelling also works, but there are additional precautions that you have to take. Because a character like Rosaria doesn't have as much front-loaded cryo application as Citlali, you even have to wait a moment after casting Mavuika's burst so that Rosaria's lance will apply cryo before you start charge attacking, otherwise you won't get a single melt with Mavuika. In a very adjacent manner, the second archetype to talk about is Vaporize. While Vaporize is much more lenient when it comes to elemental application setup because it takes 2 applications of Pyro to get rid of 1 application of Hydro, it does lack the team options that Melt has. Because Mavuika prefers to perma-charge attack during her field time, we cannot use common Hydro applicators like Xingqiu or Yelan who require the active character to normal attack. That means for players without Farina, you're pretty much out of luck unless you want to weave in some normal attacks to be able to use Yelan or Xingqiu. Kokomi can kind of substitute for Farina thanks to her ability to hold the Thrilling Tales catalyst and her strong healing, but you still lose a ton of buffing power and her jellyfish cannot move around with enemies like Farina's summons can. For the final 2 slots, you typically want to fill them with at least 1 Natlan character and strong supports. The best setup for a Vaporize team will include Bennett and Shilonen for strong buffs and high fighting spirit generation with a second Natlan character, but honestly, Farina and Mavuika are strong enough that this might be overkill. If one of these 2 characters are occupied by another team, any combination of Bennett, Shilonen, Animo buffers, Animo healers, or Kachina/Zhongli to hold the 4-set Scroll or 4-set Archaic Petra also work fine as well. Outside of those 2 main carry playstyles, Mavuika's value proposition to other teams is very simple, whether that be through damage contribution or quality of life with her simple pyro application. I'll quickly list a couple of teams where she provides improvement for other recent Natlan characters, but if you don't see one of the teams that you were looking for, that doesn't mean it's not viable. We're simply covering the biggest winners when it comes to Mavuika's release. And the first winner is most definitely Mualani. Not only is Mualani's Hydro application slow enough to take advantage of Mavuika's 2-second pyro application rate, but Mavuika is also so much easier to build than a 250% plus energy recharge Xiangling for many players. When you tack on the fact that she can hold the 4-set Scroll for Mualani for those that are missing Shilonen on their account, it turns out that she's actually a pretty good quality of life unit for Mualani. The second winner with Mavuika's introduction is Chasca, and that notion also stems from the fact that Mavuika becomes a Xiangling replacement. With Chasca, Xiangling is not awkward due to her high energy build as a solo pyro, but instead with her pyro nado. Against smaller enemies, it can get really awkward to have the Pyronado hit enemies without hovering directly over them and forcing them out of Chasca's aiming window. Running Mavuika can work as a direct Xiangling replacement to create a team of Chasca, Mavuika, Bennett, and Farina, but you can also mix and match other elements as well to maximize Chasca's passive. For example, running a triple Natlan character team with Chasca, Mavuika, and Citlali can easily cap out the fighting spirit from Mavuika to launch a max multiplier elemental burst with a melt setup from Citlali. As for some of the other teams, I think 2 of the most common that people will ask about are Kinich and Chevreuse, but those do have their slight inconveniences. For Kinich teams, Mavuika is a great pyro applicator for burning, but the only issue is that past your first rotation, the burning aura will perpetually keep pyro on the enemy and it will be extremely difficult to proc the 4-set Scroll without another element to cleanse that burning aura every rotation. That can pose an issue for newer players who are spending more time in combat, but for players with enough investment in their Kinich team's gear, you'll probably be able to clear most content after just 2 rotations, so that inconvenience isn't something that makes Mavuika with the 4-set Scroll unplayable. If something like this does worry you, the 4-set Obsidian Codex is still beyond broken for even a support Mavuika just for the huge damage increase that it gives her elemental burst, and by running the 4-set Obsidian Codex you no longer have to worry about the reaction setup for those who just want to press buttons and see big numbers. For Chevreuse teams where Mavuika is the main character, right now she is locked to Redhorn as a support because her burst heavily incentivizes running a second Natlan character for fighting spirit stacks since they play a huge part in her damage output. Additionally, with such high multipliers on her kit, losing out on Vaporize or Melt reactions hurts her damage output much more than a character like Arlenkino, for example, who only vaporizes about 1/3 of her damage. Do these inconveniences mean that these teams are bad? Absolutely not. I just want to be transparent with the idea that although Mavuika is an insanely strong unit, not every team archetype will be perfect with her. But with that, I hope you guys enjoyed this Mavuika guide, and most importantly, I hope this guide was helpful for building the perfect Mavuika for your account. Other than that, it's the same as always. I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.